Hello, everyone, and welcome to Making the Most of Your Postdoc. My name is Dylan Riediger, and I'm the coordinator of Career Diversity for Historians and Institutional Research here at the American Historical Association. And it's my great pleasure today to introduce our panelists who will be staging this really important conversation today. Over the past couple of decades, postdocs have become relatively common first jobs for new PhDs. Just for example, between HNet and the AHA's job board, there have been several hundred postdoc positions open to history PhDs each year over the last several years. And as these kind of positions have become more common, the work associated with being a postdoc has really proliferated. They're still often associated with kind of relatively unfettered time to work on converting the PhD into a book and serving as a bridge, at least in theory, to a faculty position. And there are certainly a lot of postdocs like this. However, a quick survey of job ads for postdocs will reveal a large number with significant teaching and/or administrative responsibilities attached, as well as a growing number of postdocs that place humanities PhDs in extremely interdisciplinary spaces, focused on public health or climate change, for example, and a small but growing number of postdocs like the ACLS Public Fellows Program that give humanists the opportunity to put their skills to work outside the professoriate and beyond the academy entirely. The individuals who obtain these postdocs can find themselves in very liminal spaces with little formal mentoring or guidance about how to best use the opportunity presented by a postdoc to further their professional development as scholars, teachers, administrators, and so forth. Postdocs are ultimately contingent positions, so they bring with them immediate pressure to line up the next job, even while you're settling into the one that you just landed. And during these especially difficult political, economic, and epidemiological times that we're in, those challenges have only become exacerbated. So we'll be talking today about what postdocs are, discussing strategies for making the most of them. I'll be introducing our panelists momentarily, but first, just a little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The AHA is deeply committed to supporting graduate students and early career historians in their intellectual and academic work, professional development, and as members of the community of historians. And this roundtable is one of the ways that we're doing that. This is the third in a series of virtual career development webinars focused on graduate students and early career historians. A schedule of those events, which we'll be adding more to in the coming days, is available online at the AHA website. Our next event in this series is an interactive workshop about aligning your skills and values in the workplace, hosted by Chris Goldie of Stanford University. That will be held on November 17th at 2 p.m. Eastern. Registration for that event will open shortly. The virtual career development series, which this is part of, is supported by the National Endowment for the Humanities, the Stanton Foundation, History, and the AHA's Career Diversity for Historians initiative. As far as format for today goes, we'll be online for an hour and a quarter. We'll spend the first 40 minutes or so in a roundtable discussion with our moderator and panelists, but we'll leave a lot of time for question and answers as well. As the conversation is going on, please use the question and answer function at the bottom of your screen to ask any questions that you'd like the panelists to answer, and reserve the chat box for technical issues. AHA staff are managing the incoming Q&A submissions and monitoring the chat line as well. We are also recording today's webinar. As you can see by the little logo at the top of your screen, it will be posted in its entirety on the AHA's YouTube channel in the near future. Finally, by participating in today's event, you've agreed to participate in the AHA's Code of Conduct. Now I'd like to introduce our panelists, and then I'll get out of the way here and we can start this conversation. Our moderator is Lindsey Martin. Lindsey is currently the Assistant Director of the Medical Scientists Training Program at Northwestern University. And before that, she was Assistant Director of the Office of Postdoctoral Affairs at Northwestern and the Program Manager at the University of Chicago's Career Diversity for Historians pilot program. Lindsey earned her PhD in history from Stanford University. Next is Beth Healey, who is currently the Assistant Director of Postdoctoral Affairs at Northwestern, where she also earned her PhD in history. Prior to stepping into her current role, Beth spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow at Northwestern as well. Courtney Wiersema is the Associate Director of Graduate Career Development at the University of Chicago. She holds a PhD from Notre Dame, where she also spent a year as a postdoctoral fellow after completing her degree. Travis Roths holds a PhD from the University of Utah. He's currently a postdoc at the Yale Center for Medical Informatics, which I think, one question I would have is what exactly that is. And before that, he was a lecturer in the history department at Yale. And last but not least is Dara Walker, who is an assistant professor of African American Studies, Women's Gender and Sexuality Studies, and History, or as we were saying before this started, of everything, at Penn State University. She first joined Penn State as a postdoctoral scholar after completing her PhD at Rutgers University. And now I'll turn it over to you, Lindsey, and to the panelists.
Thank you, Dylan. Thank you, Dylan and Megan, for setting this up and moving it to a virtual format. I want to thank our 4 brilliant panelists for being here. They have a lot of great information to share on postdocs, and also everyone who can join us. Dylan covered all of the major points, I think, introducing the panels. So I'll just be really brief and say, we started this conversation a year ago with the realization that postdocs are tough, but they're becoming this normal part of academic life now, but no one's talking about it. And it seems really relatively unexamined. And in all the conversations we've had leading up to this, it's a really challenging and confusing time. And the advice is really outdated. It's still a lot of treat it like a sabbatical. And I'm not sure that ever served anyone well, but it's not serving anyone well now. So today, we're really hoping to kind of open up this kind of reflection and examination of what the postdoc is and what it can be. And in particular, have a moderated discussion about kind of things to help you think through how to make the most of this really pivotal transitionary time. It's a short period of time, but how can you think strategically about things you need to do? How can you be productive? How can you find mentoring? And how can you also, at the same time, on top of all of this, think about what is next? And we also want to cover some points about how institutions can support you, but also how you can also extract most resources as possible from your institution during this brief amount of time. So really, without further ado, I think we just jump in, because I know our panelists have a lot of really great advice and experiences to share. In our first question, I want to ask our panelists to take a couple of minutes to talk about their postdoctoral experience, particularly because you'll see there's a real breadth and kind of diversity of experience here that is reflective of opportunities in the field. So this might be a great way just to learn more about that and what you did during your time as a postdoc. Who would like to jump in first?
I can go ahead and go first. So I had a 1-year postdoc at Penn State University, and it was a postdoc with the Richards Civil War Era Center and the Africana Research Center. So it was 1 year, and the plan was to come for 1 year. It's a postdoc that did not include teaching responsibilities, but it included a kind of professional development workshop series, which was wonderful. And so what that meant was that we had workshops on how to write or turn a dissertation chapter into a peer-reviewed journal article that you would then submit. We had a workshop on how to have conversations with the press. And so we had the UNC press editor come. At that point, it was Chuck Grinch. And talk through how do you write a book proposal, how do you pitch the book proposal. We had professional development workshops on creating networks, and then also we had outside readers come in and read our entire manuscript, what was likely dissertation at that point, and give us feedback on how to turn the dissertation into a book, because they are coming with an outside view, right? They're not your dissertation committee. And so my 1-year postdoc actually had the potential to turn into a tenure track position. So it was what we might consider a pipeline postdoc. And so that's going to mean a couple of different things that I hope to kind of flesh out today.
Thank you. Next up, Courtney.
I can go next. So my postdoc was from the institution I received my PhD from the University of Notre Dame. And it was a 1-year position, and it seems part of an increasing number of these sort of postdocs provided to PhDs of an institution. The place where I advise PhD students and postdocs now, the University of Chicago, also has a new crop of these. So it's an interesting experience to stay at the institution and still have access to those resources and supports while trying to navigate a new stage and kind of separate yourself from that graduate identity. In terms of what the postdoc looked like, it was supposed to be a 2-2 teaching load, 2 courses a semester. The first semester I taught 1 undergraduate course and helped co-teach a professional development course for graduate students. In the spring, my job title changed, not without agreement on my part, but I ended up doing some undergraduate advising and director of undergraduate studies work temporarily because there was a need in the department. And that actually turned out to be a blessing because ultimately that helped me pivot career-wise. So that wasn't part of the postdoc's design, but it was a really valuable mix of things. And the more time I spent as a postdoc, the more I realized that these other options were interesting to me. So kind of a unique experience, but one that I think can happen sometimes when you stay put for that postdoc.
Thank you. Beth.
I can go.
Yeah.
Like Lindsey, my postdoc was at the institution where I earned my PhD, which is Northwestern, and it's still my employer today. And I held a public service fellowship sponsored by the Shabraya Center for Historical Studies. And like the others, it was a 1-year position, but in this one, I was sponsored by the department to be placed with a local nonprofit. My background is in the history of the Holocaust, and I was placed with a Holocaust education and human rights education nonprofit that focused on curriculum for middle and high school students. And my role was to work with them to flesh out and develop their Holocaust curriculum. So there was no teaching, and there was really no time for my own research, but it was drawing on my academic skills, but in a completely different framework.
All right, and I've been in my postdoc now since July, basically, but sort of the academic year. The summer was a bit weird. I don't know if you heard, but there were things going on, and none of us have met anyone. So, I mean, part of this is also the fact that I've been starting a postdoc in the middle of a pandemic, which is a little bit weird. Thankfully, I had already been at my institution for a little bit in the history department, and so I was really moving sort of across campus to a very different place. Let me say a little bit about that. So I'm currently in the Center for the Yale Center for Medical Informatics. So I'm a postdoc in informatics, which is a strange sort of meta-discipline in science and medicine that officially studies information without necessarily any interest in its the domain knowledge contained within that information. And so medicine has a lot of this, like there's a lot of information that gets passed around and used and sort of translated between things that, you know, that most people in medicine who are using that information don't necessarily have domain level expertise in that. So informatics, though, is closely associated with medicine, but is not actually simply medical informatics. And there are informatics programs or information science programs that exist independently. Ours is not one of them, but the people who run the center are cool, I guess, and really like the idea of bringing a historian on board. We also have a linguist. So we've got a sort of interdisciplinary crowd, and I managed to sort of find my way over there. And how that happened, if you're playing career diversity panel bingo, now's the part where you get to mark off the, no one could probably ever follow me down this path. It's probably a once in a lifetime kind of trajectory, which I think is often a story that history PhDs end up telling if you get a job doing something else. Is I'm not sure anyone else could ever do this. I just sort of lucked into it in a variety of ways. In any case, it's a multi-year fellowship. It's at least 2, it might be 3. And I'm officially employed by the VA, and I have then a courtesy appointment at Yale But so I'm officially sort of a government employee. So I say some of this because it can be really tricky, I think, especially once you get outside the humanities, sort of where the money comes from and where your institutional appointment is. All of those things can be much more flexible. I have no teaching and am instead sort of assigned to a handful of projects, one of which is beginning, and with my help, a historical take on computing at the VA and the sort of information systems at the VA. And they're
Great.
excited to have a historian on board because they keep telling me, you can write, which I guess they just hope that I can. I hope I can.
If there's anything I hope all of us can do, it is write. We spend enough time doing it. Thank you all for those great overviews of your positions. I think it brings up a lot of kind of things we'll touch on the rest of the conversation. To kind of jump into kind of our first big meaty question, how did each of you navigate the transition from graduate student to postdoc? And this might look differently from each of you because some of you, graduate student to postdoc was, as Courtney said, kind of differentiating yourself from a graduate student at your home institution, while for others, you were moving to an entirely new institution and had to somehow integrate yourself into that whole academic community. So yeah, how did you navigate that? Travis, you're still unmuted, so I'm gonna call on you.
Oh, okay.
Thank you.
Teaches me not to hit that.
That's how this works.
Okay. No, this is interesting because I've been done for a while, and so the answer to this question works in a couple of different ways. And I was on a term-limited instructional faculty position at Yale in the history department before this, and so I was sort of a one-year lecturer a couple of times. And so in some ways I had an experience. It wasn't a postdoc, but it was actually more like what the postdocs that I think a lot of people have now that are teaching postdocs. And that's sort of the first thing I did out of graduate school. And that involved sort of finding my way into a department that was very familiar to my department, and finding a place to plug in within it. And at a place like Yale, you know, the departments are so large that it really is about finding the people on the faculty who do what you do, as opposed to at a smaller institution where there might be exactly one person who does anything. And so one of the things I had to do in the department, in the history department, was sort of figure out the people who worked on topics similar to mine and meet them and introduce myself to them. But in terms of the switching then from a faculty position, an instructional faculty position, to the postdoc, the experience has been rather different, because now I'm on the STEM side, and this is entirely a position that they imagine as an opportunity for me to develop my skill sets in some self-directed way. And there's sort of no one there to tell me what that way should be or what it is that I need to develop. And so it's very open-ended in all the good ways and all the bad ways that can be. I think that I'll probably share that in common with the other folks who come next.
Yeah, and if we want to stay on the theme of kind of switching institutions, you know, Dara moved from Penn State to Rutgers. How was that transition for you?
Yeah, so it was an interesting transition in that, so there's the question of space, which, you know, if anyone has questions about that in Q&A, we can talk about. But one of the things to note is that for the postdoc that I had, we actually had to do a campus interview, which is, you know, I've only heard from my friends who have postdocs in the UK that's a kind of similar model to that approach. But what that meant was that when I came to campus for the interview, I started meeting people in various departments. And so, you know, I had interviews with folks, I met with some of the graduate students. And so what that meant was that once I had accepted the postdoc, that time between me accepting and coming, people were still in conversation with me. And so we're sending emails, we're talking about, you know, what's going to happen when I get here. And so that made the transition, I think, much smoother than it would have been had I come in blind, or had I come in not aware of who is here. And so for me, that transition was relatively easy. I think that the professional development workshops also made it pretty easy. You know, folks are referring to my dissertation as the book, and I'm just like, what book? I just wrote it, I just finished it, like I just barely defended the dissertation. You want to call this a book? It's like, not a book. It's not a book. But, you know, those kinds of things helped me transition and become comfortable with that in-between space. But the other part is, you know, the question of how did we kind of get integrated into the institution? As I mentioned, my postdoc was a pipeline postdoc. And so what that means is that that first semester, I was basically on the job market at the institution where I had my postdoc. And so you do those job market things, you go to talks, you go to different events. And so that was the kind of way that I got integrated into the university, is through these opportunities, which also was good intellectually, because what that meant was, or at least the way I approached that was, even if I'm hanging out with Civil War historians, I study Black Power, civil rights, but there are others who are like in geography, who are also women's and gender studies, and I'd go to these seminars, and my goal was always to leave the seminar with one sentence about how this idea or this story that I just learned about is going to help me sharpen my own book that apparently people said I was writing. And so that's kind of how I was able to get integrated into the institution. It was through meeting people at the interview process, but also just kind of using the opportunity, not having to teach, to go to these exciting events where you get to meet people, and people get to meet and get to know you.
Yeah, great. Thank you. What about if you're transitioning your position at your PhD institution, Beth and Courtney?
So in some ways, it wasn't really much of a transition. I mean, I had already been at Northwestern for a number of years. I didn't even have to move. That was great. I got to stay in my apartment in Chicago. But the biggest transition was not so much in my surroundings or my community, but in how I thought of my next steps and what my priorities were. The PhD, obviously, you're working towards finishing your dissertation and you're working towards getting a job, but you're doing that over a number of years. And you have sort of the whole path is laid out for you. You do coursework, you do exams, you do research, you write over years. Now I had 1 year and I had to figure out, you know, what was next in a way that was not to discount the pressure that you face as a grad student to find a postdoc or find a job, but felt very immediate in a way that it hadn't before. And so for me, the biggest thing was not so much adjusting to being a postdoc versus a grad student or to my particular surroundings, but to realizing that I had to prioritize myself first above anything else, including my research and my academic aspirations, which I do, you know, considered as part of myself, but I had to really think first and foremost about what am I doing when this is up? How am I going to support myself? Where am I getting my rent money from? And that was just a completely different way of thinking than I had been thinking as a grad student, despite the fact that I never had money as a grad student. But there was still a certain stability in that. So I think the biggest shift and change that I had to do was sort of thinking about what would be next and sort of having to prioritize myself in a way that I wasn't used to doing either as a historian or just as a person.
Yeah, that resonates with me too. And as I mentioned earlier, staying at the same institution has wonderful benefits. Like I had not only mentors there already, but like a social support system and all these things that are incredibly helpful as you go through any life transition. Even though I was at the same institution, it's like I slipped into a liminal space though, as Dylan said earlier. Suddenly I wasn't on a graduate student emailing list or a faculty emailing list, so I just wasn't on the emailing list. It's kind of a forgotten category often, so you really have to speak up and advocate for yourself and make sure that you're getting news and learning things. So that was a bit of a rude awakening, I guess, that it's not that, there's someone constantly looking out for you. You really need to be doing that for yourself, which I know in some ways we all do all along, but it definitely, it felt like a shift. The other thing I'll say, staying at the same place, maybe something to be mindful of. I feel like I didn't really take a break, or it didn't feel like there was a lot of separation. I just sort of went right from working on the dissertation to, okay, what do I need to do for a book proposal? And I think mental health wise, that may have not been the best for me either. Maybe getting some of that separation could have been helpful, as hard as it would have been to forego the social support system. So yeah, I think it can be a challenging space for sure. Also, I didn't end up writing the book, but it still was something I was thinking about. And there too, I felt like there were a lot of structures in place to help you think about a dissertation. But when you move to some of these other forms, the lack of structure is definitely something to get used to.
Thank you for sharing that. I want to dip really quickly into the Q&A because I think this is relevant now. Travis, I know you spoke directly to this, but Dara, you also talked about kind of building social networks, and Courtney and Beth, but how do you do all this now? I mean, the question is, when you can't, take advantage of the same in-person opportunities, do you have any advice for how postdocs just starting out can make these connections that were, kind of easy to do by just walking into a seminar, but now is really hard when you have a Zoom and you can't even see who's attending a talk? Any quick advice or tips?
Yeah, I mean, I would say get on listservs. So whatever the host department or program or center, whatever institutional unit, try to get on their listserv so that you can learn about upcoming events. Attend those events. If there's someone who says something that really vibes with you, you hit them up via email after, right? And you say, I'm here as a postdoc and I attended this thing. I really enjoyed your talk and would love to connect with you over Zoom. Some of us are going to be Zoomed out, to be completely honest about that. But I think if you frame it as, just an introductory, I'm interested in this, it's less than 30 minutes probably, right? Maybe an hour most. And then, so taking that kind of initiative, I think also, for example, women's and gender studies, we have a social hour. So even if it's not an event through a listserv, maybe you hear about these kinds of social events. And so a lot of it's going to be getting on listservs, connecting with the person who's your supervisor or mentor, and then having them do that. Part of that labor should actually go on them. If you have a mentor, it's almost the same as, I guess the idea when we were at conferences is that someone would pull your hand and introduce you to a person that's probably at a bar or something, I don't know. But it can look very different now, but the point is that they should also partake in some of that labor. But on your end, it's reaching out to listservs and then connecting with people after.
Can I add on to that? So I started my current position as the assistant director in Northwestern's Office of Postdoctoral Affairs 4 days after Illinois went into lockdown. So I have never actually been to my office or met any of my coworkers in person, except for the ones who I interviewed with. And so that's been, a very weird way to start a job and to get to know people and sort of to integrate yourself into the community. But so for a postdoc specifically, I think everything Dara just said is exactly right on, even though I think as, academics, many of us think of ourselves as sort of, shy, bookish people. And I know for me, learning to do that required pushing myself out of my comfort zone, but also find whatever institutional resources are available for you at your university or center or wherever you are and take advantage of it. So if there's a postdoc office, find them and make them your friend. So Lindsey ran the postdoc office at Northwestern when I was a postdoc, and thank goodness I found her because she was invaluable. And so find those things. Now more than ever, those offices are thinking about how to support postdocs and other people in this remote environment, and it's their job to help you. So make them do their job.
And probably, we'll move on. We can circle back to this. One thing I would add as someone who I started my job 2 weeks before lockdown. One little thing I tried to do was if it was going to be a long email, I just asked someone, could we do a 10-minute Zoom call instead? And it was really, I mean, I've never met most of my colleagues either, but just trying to have some face-to-face, you know, they at least recognize me. So when we're back in the office, maybe at some point, but just little things like that of, you know, trying to bring as much personal interaction into this virtual world as one possibly can. Moving on in the interest of time, and again, we can definitely circle back to all of these pandemic related questions in the Q&A. Dara kind of really set us up nicely for the next question. And Dara, I don't mean to put you on the spot if you want to jump in and answer this first. But what did mentoring look like in your postdoc, and how did you get the mentoring you needed for that phase of your career?
Yeah, so I often like to joke that I had no idea who my official mentor was, which was a good thing. And what I mean by that is that so many people were kind of like hands on deck and deeply committed to and invested in my development as a scholar, but also as a person who like just got out of grad school, right? And so I had no shortage of mentors. Now, my core mentors included Bill Blair, who's at one point was the head of the Richard Civil War Era Center, the Journal of Civil War. And so it was great because I had a person I could talk to about publishing in journals. He's been in the game for more than 30 years at this point. And so that was one of my main people. I also had Nan Woodruff, who again had been here for a couple of decades, civil rights movement historian. And so I had mentors in different parts of the institution. And what that meant was that I could distribute the labor, so to say, in terms of what my needs were. And that's incredibly important, I think, especially as a postdoc, because that allows you to have this wide network. And Carrie Ann Rockmore has a really great resource. She has like this mentoring map where you can have like 30 different mentors. That's a lot, but the point is that no one mentor can meet all of your needs. And so Penn State really taught me that. And in terms of kind of thinking through, you know, the role of the mentor, these are folks who introduced me to scholars. These are folks who I felt really comfortable with sending drafts that were maybe at 25 or 50%. You know, being completed. And so there's a level of comfort that I felt there. But these are also mentors who said, listen, you just finished graduate school, you're transitioning. We still want you to take care of yourself as a whole person. And so that meant we went out to go see shows, we went out to dinner. But even, you know, as a scholar, like going to go see Clyburn Park had me thinking about how do we think about segregation and gentrification. We're just hanging out at the theater. But my mentor said, I want you to think about the liberal arts in a different way, but I also want you to be a whole person and get to enjoy some part of this fellowship. And so for me, that kind of gave me a sense of the kind of ethic I look for in a mentor. And that really also gave me a sense of the kind of mentoring that can make a postdoc year, whether it's a year or 2 or 3 years, really manageable and doable.
Great, thank you. Courtney,
I can follow that just because I think that resonates so much with my story, where in graduate school, I think because you have a primary mentor, and mine was a great one, and so I relied on him a ton, but you definitely need more people the further you get on. And you can't, even though I was assigned a mentor as part of my postdoc, that person was helpful with academic things, but as the postdoc wore on and I started to think about other career options and what I was going to do, I actually relied more on friends I had on campus who were in staff jobs and the advice they had for getting those positions, other people in my cohort who had recently navigated career transitions or left ABD and got another job, or even, you know I say this in my career advising, the cliche about informational interviews, I'm sure everyone's heard that, but I did some of those with strangers on campus too, who really, they had PhDs, they had other jobs, and they could really provide hands-on advice on how to make that transition in a way that, as I said, I did not lack for academic mentoring, but those folks just were not immersed in how you write a resume and how you do some of these other basic things. So broadening your sense of who a mentor is, thinking about your colleagues and peers as mentors, that was really helpful for me.
So I'll talk a little bit. My current my postdoc has like a really structured mentoring program in some ways, and in some ways that structure means that it actually like it doesn't. Well, let me just explain. So I have an official mentor who's basically the head of the center at which I work, and postdocs are the lifeblood of the center. They sort of are just the constant, churn of people through the center doing new and exciting scholarship. And it's really her job. She sits down with me basically every 2 weeks, and she wants to know what I need. She's concerned with me getting what I need out of this program in terms of professional development. She knows that I'm in a bit of a career transition, or at least that I'm considering a career transition, so that I might go in a variety of different directions on the way out, and I'm exploring those options. So she wants to know what I need, which is interesting because that's also what I want to know. And she largely can't tell me. And so that has to be someone else. She wants to know what I need from the program, from the institution, from her, and then she'll get it for me. And that's very, very helpful. And it's good to have those people who are looking out for you. That's in large part because there are other people who will be very interested in what you can do. And if you're in a teaching position, this is certainly true in my research position. I got attached to some projects. And those are the people who, it's not in their job description necessarily to care about my career development over time. They're interested in what I can do to help advance a project, which of course will advance my career. And so I'm contributing to this project, and they're really thinking about the project and me contributing to it, and I'm getting experience from that. But if I turn to those people and say, like, sort of stare into the mud puddle Zoolander style, is this an old reference? Can I still talk about Zoolander? Yes, thank you, thank you. Younger folks, it's an older movie, you should Google it. But if I stare into the mud puddle and say, who am I? Like, these people are not going to be able to answer me. And so for those people, you sort of need these unofficial mentors. And these can really be peer-to-peer. They can come from anywhere. But what you need is someone who will sort of live in your particular liminal state with you, try to see the world as you see it, and guess at your career trajectory, and then help you imagine what you would have to do to hit any number of targets out there. And so one of the people who's doing that with me right now is just a more advanced postdoc in the program. He comes from the other side of things and is interested in how historians think. I'm a historian interested in how he thinks as an information scholar. And so we've developed a great working relationship in that way. But these people can come from anywhere. I had great relationships with curators of the libraries who worked basically in my subject matter areas. So the curator at Beinecke and some of the folks, librarians at the Lewis Walpole Library. But I've had really great relationships with those people who have helped me to think about my work in ways that connect to them, and therefore in very different ways to the ways that I've thought about it before, who probably don't think of themselves as mentors to me, but they've helped me figure out things in to a tremendous degree. And I think in some ways, these are the people who will help you figure out like who you might be able to become when you grow up and how to get there in a way that your official mentor or your official boss might not be able to, precisely because that's just not the function of that relationship.
Yeah, thank you. Beth, we're hearing a lot about kind of mentoring teams and finding different mentors for different needs. Do you have thoughts on that?
I just want to, I think, underscore a lot of what the others have already said, although I have to say, Dara, I'm a bit jealous of your experience. That sounds fantastic, because while mentorship was really important to my postdoc experience, that mentorship did not come from the postdoc itself. It was people I knew in other places, in other ways, and that I had to sort of go out and get myself. And again, Lindsey in the postdoc office was key in helping me there, but it wasn't built into my postdoc, at least to the program itself. And I also just want to underscore what Travis is saying about the importance of having multiple mentors from different backgrounds and who see things in different perspectives, especially right now, given that we really I mean, we know the job market's going to be bad, but beyond that, we don't really know that much. You have to be preparing for multiple career possibilities and possible trajectories. And so having as many people in different fields as possible is both just necessary, but it also makes it a lot easier to sleep at night to know that you're like doing everything you can to make sure that you're going to have something lined up when the time comes.
Thank you. We've got some good questions about mentoring in the Q&A, but in the interest of time, I think we'll just dive into our last question in our last 8 minutes or so. So the last question, and we've actually gotten a lot of comments in the Q&A about this too, is basically what does productivity look like in your postdoc? They're short positions, 1 or 2 years. How in this short amount of time do you balance all the obligations you have just as a postdoc? How do you also then think about gaining new skills? Doing projects you want to do while also constantly have to be thinking about what comes next. It's a lot to juggle. Any advice on how you did it and how one might do it?
So like I said, I had a 1-year postdoc, but that also meant that as soon as I got here, I was immediately back on the job market. And so what was useful for me is to say, what are 3 achievable goals? Like, what are 3 things that I can probably get done in this 1 year? The first was get a tenure track job. So that meant that I need to allot time towards applications, but that it also allowed me to limit how much time I was spending doing the job market stuff here, like going to events, et cetera, because I didn't have an offer letter from them. So that was the first goal. The second goal was to finish my book proposal. And then the third goal was for me to finish research for an additional chapter that I wanted to add to the manuscript. And so in some ways I achieved all of those goals with the exception of finishing the book proposal. I actually wish I would have prioritized the article, so working on research for an additional chapter, but also doing the article, because I puttered around on the book proposal because I needed distance from the dissertation. And I did not, I was so ready. I was like, I need to get a book contract. I was like, no, you need distance. You need a break, right? Mentally. And my mentor tried to tell me that. And so what ended up happening is I did archival research. That was pre-COVID, thankfully. And I attended and presented at, I think, 4 or 5 different conferences. But what those conference papers allowed me to do was to sharpen the book proposal draft, like those kind of big ideas that I wanted to bring to it. The conferences also helped me figure out the direction for a different article for the second book project. And so for me, those were 3 and then I got a tenure track job, right? So those were the 3 manageable goals. And so again, that article, I think the article is just much more doable, especially coming straight out from just finishing the dissertation and really needing that intellectual space from it.
Thank you, Dara.
Yeah, I would go ahead and echo that. I saw someone in the Q&A has already asked this question about whether you should prioritize articles or the book. I mean, that depends on your particular, what you have to work with from the dissertation. But my sense is like some space from that thing is going to be really necessary, depending on how you finished and when. But taking some time away from your dissertation, if you want to write a book rather than an edited dissertation, is going to be really useful. You don't have a ton of space to get, but something anyway to shift your perspective on what you're working on and to see it in a slightly different way is going to be helpful when you come back. Or else you're just going to write, I want to write my dissertation again, except better, which is not a proposal. Yeah, it's not very doable either. Beyond that, I think the main goal is to really think about, I mean, your main job is to get a job out of this. This is a temporary position. It's you know, it really doesn't deserve to be compared in a lot of ways with contingent faculty, but they are deeply contingent positions. With a lot of privilege baked into a lot of postdocs, certainly not all. Some of them are increasingly just like contingent faculty positions. But I think it's fair to treat these as fairly extractive, which is that, you know, you got hired perhaps to do a particular job or to do a particular thing, or maybe not, maybe just to be yourself in a particular space, depending on the kind of postdoc it is and what it is. But I think it's useful to think about this as relatively extractive, and to think, what do I need to do? What skills do I need to gain? What lines on my CV do I need? What are the biggest, highest impact things that I could have a year from now on the job market that would, whatever job market that is, and I don't mean that the academic tenure track job market is the only job market that exists, but on any job market that I might want to try to crack, what is it that I need that would actually make a difference? And in a lot of cases, like a book proposal will help you on maybe exactly one of those. Some published articles will help you on more. You know, if there are some skills, so I'm taking classes right now and learning to write Python backward and forward and a bunch of other things that I didn't expect to be doing. And those are skills that I can gain right now, and they're big. And because I can get them right now, they're high impact. Something that would take me the full 3 years to realize, like hopefully finishing my book by the end of this or something, would be a very, I think, low impact use of my time. So I don't know, be strategic, kind of.
Courtney and Beth, I'm going to be a little heavy-handed in guiding your answer because I imagine where you're going to go, but also this will kind of segue into the Q&A. I mean, you both transitioned from postdocs to administrative positions. And so how did you use the time to do that in terms of gaining new skills? And do you see that as like a worthwhile transition? Like, was that a useful transition time for both of you in terms of kind of thinking about a job that left the academy?
I can go first unless Beth has thoughts, but I think if you are looking beyond the professoriate, time is like the most essential variable, because even if you've done a lot of things to prepare, a career transition always takes time. And if you can put a postdoc to work toward that end, I think that's so helpful in avoiding, you know, not having insurance or a period of unemployment or something like that. So you really can use these positions that way. And in a lot of the work I do now advising students in postdocs, they sort of feel like, oh, maybe I shouldn't be, you know, I should really be focused on my research or only doing teaching or only things that serve the institutional mission. And that's why I appreciate Travis's point that no, they're getting what they need from you. So you really do need to look out for yourself and what's going to serve you in the long term. And so if you want to take a class during your postdoc, if you want to have a part-time job that you know, if that's okay with your visa and everything, do these things, because that could ultimately help in the long run. I did find this a little tricky to balance. I'd say for the first half of my postdoc, I focused more on academic things. I did not follow the good advice to leave the dissertation alone for a while. I was like, oh no, I'll just dive right back in. That was terrible. So I think that was helpful. But ultimately, as the time went on and as I started to see what I wanted my life to look like in the future, which included choosing where I lived, it became important to think about other things. So I really stopped doing any research and I just did all job hunting from like January forward, all administrative things for the university to get those skills, and talking to people and doing that. So that kind of became my full-time job for like 4 or 5 months during the postdoc.
I'll just say that when I started my postdoc, I didn't know that I was going to be transitioning into a staff administrative type position. It was certainly a possibility, and I had thought about it, but when I started my postdoc, I was doing both the academic job market while also looking for administrative and nonprofit and other types of roles. And that most of the things that I did that I think were ultimately helpful in landing the position where I am now were not actually things that I did during my postdoc, but things that I had done during grad school. And during grad school, I had been, you know, I knew what the job market was like and I was worried. So I was like, all right, I'm going to try and do these other things to try and gain different skill sets and experiences. So I, you know, worked for a variety of different campus centers and did some administrative stuff and things like that. And those experiences, I think, were the ones that were probably the most useful in getting my position now. But what the postdoc was useful for was, and I think like Courtney, I had this realization sort of around January. You know, the postdoc had started in September, and it was around January that I had this realization that like my priority had to be me and getting a job. And so like, yes, from 9 to 5, I was doing the stuff that I was supposed to be doing, but I wasn't killing myself to do it in the way that I had been like throwing myself into my dissertation in my research. And when the day was over, like that was over. And then it was time to focus on whatever I needed to do to get whatever kind of job I was looking at. And that's, I guess, the best I have to say about that.
I think that's really great. And I mean, from my own postdoc experience, but then having worked with a lot of postdocs, I think that mind shift of graduate to postdoc where I need to do what I need to do for me is such a huge shift. And the earlier you can kind of prepare for that, the better. I don't know how I did it or why, but I moved into my postdoc and I refused to do any more academic labor that was not connected at all to what I had to do. I turned down offers to write chapters and participate on panels because, I don't know, somewhere in the back of my mind, I knew that was not going to pan out. And at the time it was hard, but it actually served me really well. So I think of yourself, you know, particularly if you're in a new institution, they don't have the same obligation to help you flourish necessarily as a scholar that maybe your graduate program feels. So do what you need to do. That's great advice. And thank you all for all of your perspectives. I've got a really interesting question here. We've been talking about the challenges of postdocs for so long. What are the hidden perks of being a postdoc, though, that maybe people aren't thinking about? In particular, the person asks, can you take advantage of staff faculty benefits? Anyone discover a hidden perk?
I will say better health insurance. That was getting off the graduate student health insurance plan really made me feel like an adult. That was nice.
I'd say that there's also more flexibility. And I mean, this also varies from postdoc to postdoc and institution to institution, but I had a lot more flexibility to do the stuff I needed to do than I had as a graduate student. And yeah, real health insurance, not that Aetna student health stuff, but real health insurance is pretty great. But as for whether you qualify for faculty staff benefits, that depends university to university and how they categorize postdocs.
I would say I think there were like, these are like small perks, but I think they matter and add up. You know, like discounts for like phone bill and like other like small like things. I think also, you know, the postdoc I had, again, it wasn't teaching postdoc, and I had research funds. And so I used a lot of that to travel to go to the archives, to present at conferences. So for example, I was able to go to Sydney, Australia to present for the Society of the History of Children and Youth, or Childhood and Youth, one of those. And so, but also honestly, just time to think, like for real, like just sit and think. Like that for me was like the biggest perk, is time to sit and think.
Travis, any hidden perks?
I mean, it's a little weird. It's like you're half student, you're half faculty, you're neither of those things together. So sometimes you still fall, like institutionally, in one area you might be more like a student, in another you might be more like faculty or staff. I'm weirdly a government employee. So it's really hit or miss, and it depends on your institution. I think that the best thing and the worst thing in some ways is that is that, like being a grad student, they're trying to get rid of you. And so they'll throw some resources at helping you go somewhere, like move on and develop and build skills or go to conferences or meet people or whatever. There's an investment in your future. That's great. But because you can't stay here, so I sort of snarkily tell people that it's a little like crashing on someone's couch. Like it's really great to have a place to transition and to figure out, but you can't stay here. Or like moving home after college or something. Like the whole idea is that this is a launching pad for something else, and that comes with some perks, but also with, you know, it's kind of a catch-22 because just like being a grad student, the one thing you can't do is stay here. Although a couple of people have stayed at the same institution, but not in the same capacity. But I haven't found any like great perks. I did weirdly get Amazon Prime Student again accidentally, so that happened. I don't know how that happened. 6 months.
That's a perk. You can take that. I would just echo something Beth also said earlier, is get to know your postdoc office, because depending on how you're classified, and they could answer all of this for you, like Northwestern postdocs could do certificate programs at like extremely reduced costs. And so if you're looking to transition, or really just, you know, these are great skills for any career. You can do a certificate program at the business school, the school of professional studies, and it could be really, really great opportunities, but it's definitely important to figure out what you have access to. And I would recommend doing that as soon as you get to campus. I mean, the postdoc office people want to help you, and humanities and social science people don't often reach out to them. And so they're thrilled when you do. So get to know the admins and ask the questions early on so you have the information you need to kind of plan ahead. What is one thing you wish you'd done differently in your postdoc? Anyone want to tackle that one?
I wish I would have taken creative writing classes. Because the book I'm writing, I'm trying to do more of a narrative approach, and now I'm trying to take writing classes as faculty. And so I think I wasn't thinking about skills building, I was thinking about getting a job, but I really think taking a creative writing class and with the funds from the university would have been nice.
I was, towards the end, I was so stressed out all the time. And people would tell me, it's going to be okay. You know, you'll find a job. It works out. And I always wanted to say, you don't know that. You don't know me. You don't know that it's going to work out fine. So I wish I could say, you know, worry less, or take care of yourself, or something. I know it's hard. It's easy to say in hindsight, but really do take care of yourself. Like career transitions are stressful. The prospect of being unemployed and moving, or any of this stuff is stressful to contemplate. So do prioritize mental health and well-being, and take care.
Travis or Beth, you want to weigh in on that, or should we move on?
I think all my mistakes are still in front of me. I'm pretty new in this. I'll let you know in a couple of years.
I would just agree with what Courtney had to say.
Great. We have several questions here that are kind of about the logistics of finding a postdoc. And in particular, one thing I wonder if you could weigh in on is how important do you think networking is to getting a postdoc these days?
I think networking is really important for everything, whether that's getting a postdoc or like finding a dentist. No matter what it is, networking is really important. And as a grad student, I hated hearing that. I still don't love hearing it. And I can't believe that I now find myself advising postdocs on an almost daily basis to do this. But it is incredibly important, and it's not as hard as I had thought. And it's not quite as scary as I had thought. And I will just put in a plug here for the AHA's networking program. I can't remember exactly what it's called, but they will match you. Like I had a phone call with Dylan, they will match you with somebody in your area and you can go. And so I met that person, and then she recommended 2 or 3 people for me to talk to, and then they each recommended 2 or 3 people for me to talk to. And I think that that's just incredibly important, whether it's for getting a job, getting a postdoc, or really any sort of advancing in your postdoc, advancing in your career, even once you've gotten those positions. It just can't really be understated.
So the one thing I would say about networking is a part of how I think about networking is community building. And that may come from the fact that I study Black freedom movements, and so I'm thinking about this a little bit differently. But in terms of who are the people that I want to have a part of my network, these are people that I see myself being in community with. These are people that I actually want to talk to. And so it's not just they're a big wig in the field or they've published so much. Like, here's a person that I know has a commitment to mentoring. If they're a senior faculty member, I've heard that they mentor people. And so when I think about networking, the way that I kind of try to remove the anxiety that can come from it is, here's this person whose work I really value, whose ethic I really value, and I want to get to know them. And I want to think through how can we collectively build the kind of, intellectual traditions or whatever the case may be. But I say that to say, one of my advocates here who advocated for me to, 1, get the postdoc, and 2, get the tenure track job, is somebody I sat on a panel with like 4 years before I even applied for the postdoc. And she just randomly ran into me like at one of the conferences before the application was due and said, I really want you to apply for this. And I did. And now this is a person that I'm writing with, that, we travel to conferences with. I didn't know her out of the blue, but we just sat on this panel. And again, it was like making that choice that this is a person I want to be in community with. It's incredibly, important thing to think about. What is the function of networking for you? And I think that can help you shape how you approach networking.
I think I would like to, I think what I'm going to do is add to that and then sort of flip that back on. It's important to think about yourself in those ways too, as a postdoc. And I think as a graduate student, you think about yourself as someone who owes someone a dissertation, and you owe a dissertation to yourself. Like everything is focused on just finishing and trying to land somewhere. I think that networking, and you won't be surprised to find out that I didn't wander into the Center for Medical Informatics without some networking involved. This was a network all the way from the beginning. So I met people and I followed those paths. I also followed a bunch of networking paths that went precisely nowhere. I chased some angles for a while that went nowhere. But I think one of the things that helps in terms of networking is to not just think about yourself and the kind of community that you want to build, like Dara said, but I think it's really useful to think about yourself as someone who might fit in someone else's community and the community they want to build, and to start thinking about yourselves. And now I'm going to be it's really a nice, beautiful image, and I'm going to make it kind of crass for a second and make it more capitalist. I think that when you're trying to sell yourself, I was thinking about this. I was like, what is the metaphor here? And I feel like a lot of people browse postdocs, like you browse the book exhibit at a conference. For a lot of people, the function of a postdoc, yeah, stick with me, this kind of works. Maybe, we'll see. I see everyone going, what? So postdocs, end up being sort of the most common or the most rapid change through an institution. And so a lot of people who meet you, they want to know, what are you working on? And you better have that's a vague question, but you better have a specific answer to that right now. What are you working on? And they want to know a handful of things. They might want to know whether you're someone that they might want to write something with someday. They want to know where you're going. This is kind of like browsing the book exhibit at a conference, where that's a fun, imperfect, but effective way to sort of stay abreast of the field and where it's going and what the hot trends are and who's moving where and where people are doing what, is to just sort of look through the books and see what they are. And people meet postdocs and they're thinking in roughly similar ways, especially senior faculty who might be in your area or maybe in an area kind of adjacent to you and are thinking like, I don't know, what might we do together? What could we, you know, or where might you go? Because you're probably not staying here. So if you go somewhere else, you know, is that way I know who you are someday and I can think about sending students there. I can think about putting other people in touch with you. But thinking about yourself as a sort of product that you're presenting to people who are very interested in sort of not like a deep, most of them are not interested in a deep relationship with you, but sort of a shallow relationship of just keeping up with what's hot and new and happening. And postdocs, that's what you are. You're sort of, you show up, you make a splash, and then you go on to something else. And most people who meet you, that's the sort of investment they're going to have with you. I think as differs from if you're a new assistant professor and you're someone that they imagine will be at their institution forever or for at least a long time. And so you're a new colleague for a long time. Postdocs are not like that. So you have to sort of approach presenting yourself in a different way.
And that's, oh, go ahead, Courtney, go ahead.
I was just going to add one small thing to the conversation is that if you're intimidated by the prospect of connecting to people who are leaders in your field or big names or something, think of the people who are only one step ahead of you. And if you want to do a postdoc in the UK, you should probably find someone currently doing a postdoc in the UK and chat with them about their experience. Same for any number of other opportunities like that. So anyway, just sometimes that feels a little easier, and they can maybe show you their application materials or give you some advice too for specific opportunities. So that was all I was going to add. Sorry, Lindsey.
No, I think that's really great advice. I think, you know, I mean, one of the questions asked is, you know, do you think about a postdoc as the way you would think about applying for a job? And to me, it would be yes. I mean, I think you're all hitting in a lot of points is, you know, if you're applying for a job, you, like Courtney said, you maybe get to know some about the institution, the people who work there, you network, you think very strategically about this. And I think there used to be a mindset that, you know, postdocs, you just kind of slouched into a postdoc. And I think sometimes you do, but I think as the market contracts moving forward and on every level, probably being, I don't know, you could disagree with me, Beth and Courtney, since you help postdocs with this all the too, but you know, I think you have to be intentional and thoughtful and, you know, treat this as a job process and not just, you know, kind of like an extension of grad school 2.0. One of the questions related to that, and this might be our last question, is when you're kind of looking at postdocs, when you just see all these ads, it could be very overwhelming to figure out what to apply to and how to apply. Do any of you have some advice on how you figured out what might be a good position for you? And I acknowledge that a good position for me was one that paid and had health insurance, so I was not a picky purchaser by any means. But as you're kind of sifting these through, how might you discern whether or not a postdoc could be a good fit or a place where you might thrive in like a broad sense of thriving?
I would look to, and now I'm saying this not as a former postdoc, but as the assistant director in the Office of Postdoctoral Affairs, is I would look to the institutional resources provided by that university. And I know there are a few postdocs that are not in universities, but for the sake of this, we'll go with universities. Look to see how many postdocs there are. Like, is there, you know, like a peer community? Because isolating as graduate school can be, postdocs in many ways are much more isolated because they're there for such a short period of time. So look at what the postdoc community is like. Look at what sorts of resources and supports you would have access to from the university as a postdoc. So that means things like, is there career advising available? Do you have access to the writing center? All of those sorts of things that you don't really think about. What sorts of professional development offerings are provided for postdocs? What sort of you know, research support? What sort of, if you have children, is there, you know, childcare support? Is there support for travel? Obviously, nobody's traveling right now, but travel for conference, for researches, whatever. Look at what sorts of institutional supports are there. And if there are none, then I'd think very carefully about your
I
next.
mean, yeah, because to hop on your point, an institutional like investment in postdoc is a sign of how, you know, an institution and department values the position and where you might be on the spectrum of postdoctoral scholar versus, you know, more contingent faculty, as Travis was talking about. You know, what's going to be there for you. And do any of you also want to weigh in on that? Yeah, Courtney, go ahead.
I can make a really cheesy point, which is I would think, you know, start with actually what you need as a person. And for me, that was, you know, I turned down a couple of offers to go teach somewhere for a year because I didn't want to just move somewhere for 1 year. So I really know that that wasn't work. So I ruled a bunch of things out based on that, that being true. And so if there are certain places in the country you need to be, certain, you know, time frames that make sense for you, that's okay to use that to not apply to everything. I think when we have a scarcity mindset and we're entering a period of immense scarcity, it feels like you must apply to everything. But I'd say banish that mentality as much as possible. Think about what you need. I know that's cheesy, but let it not go without saying.
It's not cheesy. It's really important advice to hear because the scarcity mindset is real and it warps a lot of things. In our last minute or two, Travis, any advice for reading some of these postdoc ads that are kind of weird? You know, bioinformatics and all of these things, since, you know, this might be more of the new, more normal moving forward.
I have the opposite of advice about that. As someone who's written tons and tons of letters and basically never gotten any responses. I've been on the job market for a very long time, and I have no luck there. Here's what I can tell you, though, is that funding outside of the humanities actually looks rather different. And so the fellowship that I'm on is a standing fellowship. It's a standing, what do they call it, mega grant or something that humanities scholars should never say. That is just, it exists just to fund the center and a rotating staff of postdocs and other scholars through it in perpetuity, effectively. And the process for getting those, nothing I had done in the humanities had prepared me for what it would look like to get one of these. And I certainly never would have found it without just talking to some people, because there are disciplines, basically STEM disciplines, in large part, don't necessarily advertise positions and then take in a bunch of applications and then hire for one, but instead have sort of like existing grant-based soft money that people come into or bring their own money and positions are created. The whole, I don't pretend to actually understand this entire side of it yet, but if you're only reading job ads and you're assuming that all the jobs that exist are in job ads, I was trapped in that for a long time, and it turns out lots of jobs exist that are not in job ads.
I think we're going to have to let that be the last word here, except for that I would really like to thank Lindsey and Dara and Travis and Beth and Courtney for a fascinating conversation today, and to thank the audience for some great questions. We got quite a few more than we managed to be able to answer today. If you're interested in following up, all of our panelists have agreed to make contact information available, and HA staff will be sending out a follow-up email after this webinar, which will include that information. So if you have a question that you'd like to have answered, please feel free to reach out to any of our panelists or to me here at the HA. Thank you all for coming. Thanks again to our panelists, and everyone have a good afternoon and be safe.